Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going. As I like to point out each and every weekday, it expands our base. I agree with Donald Trump. President Trump put out a posting on Truth Social, and he suggested that the question of presidential power should be resolved by the Supreme Court. And Donald Trump is 100% correct. Every day there is greater ambiguity. Does the president have the authority to impose tariffs? Does the president have the authority to put rules on Harvard University? Does the president have the power to rule by executive order? These are real constitutional questions, and they deserve to have answers. Now, I have a very strong opinion, as all of you know, and Donald Trump and his administration clearly have a very strong view as well. The job of the United States Supreme Court is to deal with these questions. Now, we know that June is just a few days away, and the Supreme Court will go on summer recess. And we also know that there will be major rulings before the court leaves for the summer break. It is vital to American national security, in my judgment, that the question of how far a president can go is resolved. This is not the first time that there has been a confrontation over presidential power. Let's go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1937, who tried to pack the Supreme Court. He was defeated in his effort by a coalition of Republicans and conservative Democrats. It was an overreach of presidential power, and, deservedly so, Franklin Roosevelt lost that battle. And Roosevelt was an extremely popular president who had just won a massive landslide in the race in 1936 against Alf Landon, who carried only two states, Maine and Vermont. We saw another confrontation of presidential power when Harry Truman decided to take over the steel industry. He made clear that what the steel industry was doing was wrong. And you know what? The Supreme Court upheld his judgment. There are times when the Supreme Court goes with, sometimes it goes against, presidents of the United States. But in the end, the decision is made by the Supreme Court. We saw it again in Brown versus the Board of Education, where Plessy versus Ferguson, which had been an existing law since 1896 and which established separate but equal, was overthrown by Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. There was debate, there was dispute, but in the end, the Supreme Court made the decision and it stuck. And of course, during the Nixon years, we had a real challenge because Richard Nixon decided he wanted the Supreme Court to respond in his image. And in the end, the Supreme Court did not. Indeed, the Supreme Court asserted its independence, even in the case of the United States versus Richard Nixon, where Nixon lost on an 8-0 decision with Justice Rehnquist, then just the justice, not Chief Justice, recusing himself. The point I want to make here is that the Supreme Court has to make this decision. This is not the first time in modern memory that the Supreme Court has been put on the spot. In the United States action, Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 5-4, resolved the presidential election of the year 2000. And in the end, Al Gore delivered a very eloquent concession speech in which he said, "I accept the decision of the Supreme Court." And that brings me to the key point here. I do not know how the Supreme Court will rule on all of these questions dealing with presidential power. But I do know that when the Supreme Court rules, whether I agree or disagree with what the court does, I will accept the ruling. We now have a situation in which some members of the Trump administration, including President Trump himself, Vice President Vance, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, and the Solicitor General of the United States are all suggesting that if the Supreme Court rules against Donald Trump, they may take it upon themselves to simply ignore what the Supreme Court has done. I want there to be no ambiguity, no question in this vital moment. Even if I disagree with the Supreme Court, I will abide by the decision. And that is the statement I would like to hear from the White House. An affirmation that it is not the president who rules on constitutional questions. It is the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the argument was made by the Trump administration that no one elected the Supreme Court, that no one elected judges, and therefore perhaps they shouldn't have the right to weigh in. That is, in my judgment, a complete misreading of the Constitution, a complete misreading of the question of balance of power. So I want this morning, as the month of June is about to arrive, and as the Supreme Court is considering what it will do in these cases of presidential power, I want to argue for the fact that the Supreme Court has an obligation to the country to act and act soon. We've been questioned about whether or not we're in a constitutional crisis. The constitutional crisis, my friends, comes from the ambiguity. Our allies don't know whether Donald Trump has the power to impose tariffs. We don't know whether what Donald Trump is doing at Harvard University violates the First Amendment. We don't know whether or not ruling by executive order is really permissible under the Constitution. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in. Now, some of you are going to say, but John, aren't you investing too much power in the decision of the Supreme Court? The answer is that that's precisely what our founders intended. I am going to watch carefully, as I have said before, two justices of the court, one Amy Coney Barrett and the other Chief Justice John Roberts. I believe, although I could be wrong, I believe I know how Thomas and Alito, two justices of the court who have supported Donald Trump in the past, how they will react now. We're not going to get a unanimous decision, I don't think, but you never know. The Supreme Court, these 9 individuals hold the power of how we interpret the Constitution in their hands. And we must hope that when the Supreme Court comes up to bat, if you will, they hit a home run. That is, they affirm the idea of balance of power. And most important of all, it is important that the ruling of the court, even if it goes against us, even if it goes against Trump and his administration, the decision has to be accepted. That is the way we operate. That is the rule of law. By the way, I can think of many decisions the Supreme Court has made with which I disagree. But you know what? Al Gore said it best when he conceded. In the end, it is the Supreme Court that we have to trust on these matters. Let's think about it this weekend, and let's wait and see what the Supreme Court does. It's not just we, the people of the United States, who are waiting. It is the world. They want to know, what power does a president really have? And that, my friends, is the most important single question that we will be addressing in the days ahead. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am John Rothman. Make sure to follow along and let me know your thoughts on the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing an episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand, which is, of course, our goal. You can interact with me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and, of course, by directly emailing me. I love reading your comments. And, of course, my special appreciation to Gogo Zoger, the wonderful producer of this podcast. Gogo makes sure that Around the Political World with John Rothman is up and running every single day. Gogo, have a great weekend. And to all of you, have a great weekend. I will be back Monday, so will Gogo, and we will be right here with Around the Political World with John Rothman. See you then.